ChatGPT said, "What if everything you believed about your own limits was a lie? What if pain, fear, and doubt weren't the end of your road, but only the beginning? Imagine a life where the voice in your head, the one that tells you to quit, to take it easy, to stay comfortable, gets drowned out by a louder, tougher, more relentless force. That voice is discipline. That voice is ownership. That voice is David Goggins. Can't Hurt Me isn't just a story of transformation. It's a grenade tossed at everything soft, safe, and average about how we live. It's a declaration of war on mediocrity, an unfiltered account of what happens when you take control of your own suffering and turn it into power. David Goggins didn't start out as a warrior. He grew up in a world poisoned by abuse, poverty, and prejudice. As a young, overweight exterminator with a bleak future and no real hope, Goggins was on the edge of becoming another forgotten statistic. But the story doesn't end there, it explodes. What follows is one of the most jaw-dropping, brutal, and inspiring personal transformations ever put to paper. Through unimaginable mental and physical hardship, Goggins reinvented himself into a Navy SEAL, ultra-endurance athlete, and elite performer. But more than that, he uncovered the mind's true potential, the hidden 60% we all leave untapped because we're afraid to suffer. Can't Hurt Me is more than just motivation. It's a manual for mental toughness, forged through fire and tested in ways most people can't imagine. Goggins doesn't sugarcoat anything. He invites you into the darkest corners of his past and the rawest edges of his present. Every chapter dares you to face your own excuses, confront your pain, and challenge the false limits you've placed on yourself. There are no hacks here, no shortcuts. Only truth, only effort, only the brutal honesty of someone who learned the hard way that greatness lives on the other side of suffering. In a world obsessed with comfort and shortcuts, Can't Hurt Me is a gut punch. It's the story of what happens when you make a decision, just one brutal, clear, honest decision, to never back down, to never accept average, and to never, ever quit. It's not about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being the hardest, the most unbreakable, the most relentless version of yourself. This is not a feel-good book. It's a call to arms. If you're looking to change your life, if you're ready to face the truth about who you are and who you could be, then welcome to the first step. Goggins isn't here to inspire you. He's here to challenge you. Because at the end of the day, life doesn't care about your excuses. And neither should you. David Goggins opens Can't Hurt Me with the powerful and emotionally charged chapter titled, "I Should Have Been a Statistic," setting the tone for a memoir that is as brutally honest as it is inspiring. In this chapter, Goggins confronts the roots of his trauma, revisiting a past marked by unimaginable abuse, fear, and psychological torment. The narrative is not written to evoke pity, but rather to demonstrate the dark and painful crucible from which he began forging the warrior mentality that would later define him. Goggins doesn't merely recall events. He immerses the reader in the visceral reality of his childhood, where survival was not a metaphor but a daily battle. Goggins was born into a world of pain, raised in Buffalo, New York, in a home that outwardly might have seemed stable, but inwardly was a prison of terror. His father, Trunnies Goggins, owned a roller skating rink and was known in the community as a charismatic businessman. However, behind closed doors, he was a cruel and sadistic man who dominated his household through relentless physical and psychological abuse. David, his older brother, and their mother lived in constant fear of this tyrant, who beat them without mercy and instilled in them a deep sense of helplessness and worthlessness. As a child, David Goggins was forced to work in his father's roller rink from a very young age, often into the early hours of the morning. The illusion of a happy, successful family was upheld by the image of a working-class business, but the cost was the childhood he never had. Sleep-deprived, overworked, and terrified, David and his family endured cycles of violence that would cripple the spirit of any normal child. His father was particularly cruel toward David's mother, who was regularly subjected to beatings. Eventually, she made the brave decision to escape with David, leaving behind his brother, who chose to stay with their father. This decision was both liberating and destabilizing. Suddenly, David and his mother were on their own, but they were free. However, Freedom did not erase the scars, nor did it come with the stability one might hope for. They lived in poverty, constantly moving and struggling to survive. The trauma David had endured didn't fade. Instead, it manifested in deep psychological wounds, an intense lack of confidence, poor academic performance, and a stutter that made social interactions painful. He became withdrawn, wary of people, and felt fundamentally broken. Throughout this chapter, Goggins emphasizes the psychological impact of his early years. He grew up feeling less than, convinced he was not smart enough, not good enough, and destined to fail. His experiences in a nearly all-white school in Brazil, Indiana, only compounded his sense of alienation. As one of the few black students in his school, Goggins was subjected to blatant racism, bullying, and ostracization. The emotional toll was staggering. He felt invisible and hypervisible at the same time, hated for his skin color and pitted for his poverty. These early experiences could have destroyed him completely, and Goggins admits that he very nearly did become a statistic. A young black man consumed by trauma, dropping out of school, turning to violence or drugs, and perpetuating the cycle of dysfunction. But this chapter is not merely a recounting of suffering. It is also the origin story of resistance. Amid the pain, Goggins began to develop a relationship with suffering that was different from most. He began to see suffering as a test, a crucible of fire that, while it burned, could also forge strength. This belief didn't develop overnight. At first, he ran from his pain, tried to numb it, deny it, and ignore it. But the pain never left. Instead, it followed him, whispering lies that he wasn't enough, that he'd never amount to anything, that his fate was sealed. The turning point in Goggins's narrative emerges subtly but decisively in this chapter. He begins to question the story he has been told about himself. What if, he asks, he could rewrite that story? What if pain could be fuel rather than an anchor? This seed of thought is the beginning of a mental transformation that becomes the cornerstone of his philosophy later in the book. He doesn't romanticize the idea. He makes it clear that embracing suffering is not glamorous. It is brutal, lonely, and often thankless. But it is also, in his experience, the only path to real strength. As Goggins reflects on the myriad ways in which he could have fallen through the cracks, failed by the system, crippled by trauma, paralyzed by fear, he anchors the reader to the reality that life is often unfair, and that some people are born into more suffering than others. He never suggests that his story is typical, or that others should compare themselves to him. Instead, his message is about radical accountability. He emphasizes that while we cannot control where we come from, we can control how we respond. He makes a compelling case that victimhood, while often justified, can become a cage. To escape it, one must take ownership of their life, even the parts that were never their fault. One of the most striking aspects of this chapter is Goggins's transparency. He does not sanitize his past or paint himself as a hero who rose effortlessly above adversity. He lays bare his brokenness, his fears, and his many moments of weakness. He admits to being terrified, ashamed, and lost. This vulnerability is what makes his message so powerful. He shows that strength is not the absence of fear or pain. It is the decision to keep going despite them. His scars are not hidden. They are offered as proof that survival is possible, and that transcendence begins with acceptance. I Should Have Been a Statistic also introduces the reader to the idea of the accountability mirror, which becomes a recurring motif in Goggins's life. In those early years, he began using the mirror not as a tool for vanity, but as a place of reckoning. He would look into it and confront his shortcomings, call himself out on his excuses, and begin to tell himself the truth. It was a painful practice, but it was the beginning of self-mastery. Goggins believes that change cannot begin until we are brutally honest with ourselves. Sugarcoating, denial, and self-pity, he argues, are the enemies of growth. This chapter also touches on the importance of role models, or rather, the lack thereof in Goggins's early life. He had no roadmap, no mentor, no guide showing him the way forward. In the absence of these, he began to imagine the man he wanted to become. He created that person in his mind and then began the long, arduous journey toward becoming him. This process required an almost delusional level of belief in the possibility of transformation. He had to reject the evidence all around him, poverty, failure, racism, trauma, and believe that he could become something more. By the end of the chapter, the reader understands just how fragile Goggins's future was in those formative years. He is candid about the fact that he wasn't special. There was no divine intervention, no miraculous moment that saved him. His salvation came from a choice, a decision to stop running from pain and instead lean into it, study it, and ultimately use it. The boy who had been beaten, broken, and belittled did not vanish. Instead, he became the foundation of the man who would go on to become a Navy SEAL, an ultra-endurance athlete, and a best-selling author. That man was built, brick by painful brick, through a relentless refusal to quit. I Should Have Been a Statistic is not just a chapter, it is a thesis. It argues that hardship, while devastating, can be the birthplace of greatness. It challenges the reader to reconsider their own excuses, to confront their pain, and to ask themselves whether they are being honest about who they are and who they could be. Goggins's early life was defined by abuse, fear, and failure. But in choosing to face his reality, to embrace suffering, and to hold himself accountable, he defied the odds. Goggins begins by unraveling the trauma he experienced at the hands of his father, Trunnies Goggins. Trunnies was a violent, abusive man who controlled every aspect of their lives. He owned a roller skating rink and forced young David, his older brother, and his mother to work long hours, often late into the night, before Goggins even started school. Despite being a child, David was not spared the harsh realities of adult labor. The business, in many ways, represented a trap. Although it brought financial success, it was a prison cloaked in lights and music, concealing a tyrant's hand behind the scenes. His father used physical abuse and psychological manipulation to dominate the household. David recalls the horrific beatings his mother endured and the constant fear that haunted him as a child. These early experiences formed the foundation of his understanding of the world, a place where safety and kindness were illusions, and fear was a constant companion. The abuse was not just physical, it was psychological. Trunnies isolated his family, controlled their interactions, and dictated their every move. David's identity was forged in this crucible of pain and fear, and for many years, it shaped his beliefs about himself and the world around him. Eventually, his mother summoned the courage to escape with David and his brother. They fled to Brazil, Indiana, a small, predominantly white town, in pursuit of a better life. But freedom from Trunnies didn't mean an immediate end to suffering. Instead, it marked the beginning of another kind of pain, the pain of displacement, racism, and continued poverty. David, already scarred from years of abuse, now faced a new battleground. In Indiana, he was often the only black child in his school, and he was subjected to overt racism and exclusion. Children called him racial slurs, teachers underestimated him, and he never truly felt like he belonged. This societal rejection added another layer of trauma. David internalized these experiences, developing a deep sense of inadequacy. He felt invisible, voiceless, and broken. School became a source of anxiety rather than learning. Struggling academically, he quickly began to fall behind. The damage from his early years made it difficult to focus. He was diagnosed with a learning disability, and he started to believe he was unintelligent and incapable. These years in Indiana were filled with silence. Silent pain, silent rage, and a silent longing to be seen and heard. Yet, even in the midst of such adversity, Goggins' story in this chapter is not one of total defeat. He introduces the concept that would become central to the entire book, the idea that facing the truth, even the ugly, painful, unbearable truth, is necessary for personal growth. For a long time, Goggins buried his past. He lied to himself and others, covering his pain with a facade of toughness or, at times, avoidance. He pretended things didn't bother him, pretended he was fine. But beneath the surface, the unresolved trauma continued to control his life. His self-worth was in tatters, his potential unexplored, his identity fractured. In Truth Hurts, He emphasizes that growth begins when we confront our own lives with unflinching honesty. He doesn't sugarcoat the past. Instead, he demands that we, like he did, turn toward our pain rather than away from it. He calls this the accountability mirror. At home, he placed post-it notes on his mirror with hard truths written on them. Things he didn't want to hear, but needed to. These notes weren't filled with vague affirmations or empty motivation. They were brutally honest assessments of his behavior, shortcomings, and failures. You're fat. You're lazy. You're lying to yourself. These messages were intended not to shame, but to wake him up. He knew he had to acknowledge what he had become, a directionless, insecure, and broken young man, before he could begin to change. He had to admit that he had allowed the abuse and racism to define him. He had to recognize how he was hiding from effort, avoiding challenges, and living below his potential. In essence, the truth was his starting point. By facing himself in the mirror every day and not looking away, he gradually began to reclaim control over his narrative. In school, he started to put in more effort. Although he was still behind academically and dealt with the pressure of a learning disability, he refused to use it as a crutch. Instead, he worked harder than anyone else. He learned to study, to read, to focus. He stopped accepting mediocrity, not because it was easy, but because he had learned that change only comes through discomfort. He was not trying to prove something to the world, he was trying to prove something to himself. The pain he had experienced had once been a weight dragging him down, but now he began to repurpose it as fuel. This shift in mindset was subtle but powerful. Rather than running from his past, he began to use it. He learned to revisit the trauma not as a victim, but as a student. What had the abuse taught him about survival? What had racism taught him about persistence? What had poverty taught him about gratitude? This reframing did not erase the pain, but it gave him a reason to keep going. He didn't want pity. He wanted power not over others but over himself. Goggins also confronts a truth about society in this chapter, that we often lie to ourselves to feel better in the short term. We avoid discomfort, ignore our faults, and surround ourselves with distractions. But comfort, he argues, is the enemy of growth. Only by choosing voluntary discomfort, by setting challenges that push us beyond our limits, can we find out who we really are. He had every reason to be broken, but he refused to let his past define his future. The truth hurts, Goggins says, but lies destroy. Many people live their entire lives running from truth, blaming others, blaming circumstances, hiding from their own reflection. Goggins challenges the reader to confront the same kind of radical truth he did. Not everyone is a victim of physical abuse, but everyone carries pain. Everyone has demons. The question is whether we face them or flee from them. He also introduces the concept of the calloused mind. Just as hands develop calluses through repeated hard labor, the mind can be calloused through repeated exposure to discomfort and difficulty. But it starts with truth. There is no shortcut. We cannot build strength on lies. And so, this chapter becomes both a personal confession and a universal challenge. Goggins uses his own life as a case study in what happens when a person stops running from their pain and starts confronting it head-on. He doesn't pretend it's easy. In fact, he makes it clear that it is the hardest thing a person can do. But he also makes it clear that the alternative, living a life of quiet desperation and wasted potential, is worse. He compares the process to self-surgery. Painful, messy, but necessary if we want to heal. And while his own story is filled with extraordinary suffering, he insists that the principle applies to everyone. We all have truths we're avoiding. We all have lies we tell ourselves. And until we're willing to be honest, change is impossible. Toward the end of the chapter, Goggins reflects on how far he still had to go. The process of transformation had only just begun. He was not yet the Navy SEAL, the ultra-endurance athlete, or the motivational force that people would one day come to know. At this stage in his life, he was simply a young man who had made a decision to stop hiding and start fighting for a better version of himself. That decision, made in the silence of his bedroom with nothing but a mirror and a few post-it notes, would change the course of his life. Truth Hurts is a chapter about beginnings. It's about stripping away illusions and facing what is real. It's about admitting that life has not been fair, but choosing not to let that fact define or limit you. It's about realizing that pain, when faced with honesty, can become a powerful teacher. Goggins doesn't ask the reader for sympathy, he demands honesty. And in doing so, he offers a model for transformation that is as hard as it is liberating. Following the harrowing abuse and psychological trauma he endured in his early childhood at the hands of his father, Goggins entered adolescence not only scarred but also largely broken inside. His father's domination had crushed his sense of identity, and although Goggins and his mother had escaped that physically abusive environment, the emotional and mental toll continued to affect him profoundly. He felt like a shell of a person, haunted by low self-esteem, persistent fear, and a sense of unworthiness. In this chapter, Goggins shows the long-lasting effects of trauma, not only what had happened to him but what continued to happen inside of him because of it. After escaping his father and relocating to Brazil, Indiana, with his mother, Goggins hoped for a fresh start. However, the reality of being one of the very few black students in a predominantly white, rural community meant that his life took on a different form of hardship. Racism was overt and omnipresent. Goggins encountered slurs, social isolation, and bullying, which compounded the internalized belief that he was inferior. It wasn't just that others treated him poorly. He began to believe he deserved it. These experiences reinforced his sense of invisibility and worthlessness. He came to accept the idea that he was not good enough, not smart enough, not strong enough, just not enough. The academic world was another battleground where Goggins struggled. His early education had been chaotic, inconsistent, and marred by constant movement due to his father's unpredictable lifestyle. By the time he reached high school, he was severely behind his peers. His reading level was that of a second grader, and he knew it. The shame of having to read out loud in class left him paralyzed with fear. He devised strategies to avoid drawing attention, like going to the bathroom at precisely the right moment or faking illness. Each class was a landmine of humiliation waiting to explode. He wasn't just scared of failing. He was scared of being seen as he truly was, unintelligent, broken, and weak. This constant fear and pressure manifested physically. Goggins developed a stutter, suffered from anxiety, and felt weighed down by depression. The emotional burden he carried was so intense that getting out of bed each morning became an impossible task. Not metaphorically, literally. He describes mornings where he would lie in bed for hours, unable to summon the energy or willpower to face the day. It wasn't laziness, but the crushing effect of hopelessness. Everything felt pointless. Every path blocked by some internal demon whispering he'd never be anything. His mother, who was working hard to build a new life, didn't fully understand the depth of his despair, and Goggins, ashamed and confused, didn't know how to articulate it, so he suffered in silence. Goggins doesn't just recount this period to elicit sympathy. He's brutally honest about the psychological damage he carried and the self-sabotaging behaviors he adopted in response. He began cheating in school, especially during tests, just to avoid humiliation and keep up appearances. He lied to teachers, faked understanding, and clung to the hope that no one would notice how far behind he really was. When it came to reading assignments, he simply wouldn't do them. Instead, he relied on charm, improvisation, and deception to get by. He began to live a double life, externally appearing to function, but internally collapsing. At one point in the chapter, Goggins vividly recounts the day he hit rock bottom. A school test he couldn't possibly complete. He panicked, not because he feared a bad grade, but because he realized there was no way out. He couldn't cheat, he couldn't fake it. The moment forced him to confront a horrifying truth. He had spent years pretending and avoiding, and now the illusion was cracking. He had built a house of cards, and now it was collapsing in front of him. That day, in a bathroom stall at his high school, crying and feeling entirely lost, he came face to face with the impossible task. Facing the truth of his life and the monstrous climb he would have to make if he wanted to become someone different. And yet, in this moment of absolute vulnerability, something extraordinary began to stir inside him. He started to understand that the pain, the fear, and the humiliation he'd been hiding from couldn't be outrun. If he wanted to be more than what life had dealt him, he had to face those things head-on. This chapter becomes a turning point, not in the sense that he instantly transformed, but because he finally stopped denying how broken he was. He began to understand that real change was not going to come from pretending to be tough or smart or competent. It would come from doing the hard, lonely, uncomfortable work of fixing himself, brick by brick. The concept of callousing the mind is first hinted at here, even if Goggins doesn't name it until later chapters. He starts to toy with the idea that maybe pain isn't just something to endure, but something that can be harnessed. Maybe the suffering he had lived with wasn't just cruel randomness, but a kind of raw material he could use. But to do that, he had to be brutally honest with himself. The lies had to stop. The cheating had to stop. The self-pity had to stop. He had to own every failure, every weakness, and every excuse. One of the most compelling emotional threads in this chapter is Goggins' relationship with his mother. Despite everything he went through, she remained his greatest supporter. She saw the good in him even when he couldn't. She didn't fully understand the depth of his suffering. How could she? But she believed in him. Her love and belief became the fragile foundation upon which he would begin to rebuild himself. But Goggins makes it clear that love alone wasn't enough. He had to decide that he was going to fight back. The impossible task wasn't a single test or assignment or even a fixed goal. It was the act of choosing to begin, to face himself fully, without distraction or delusion, and to do the ugly, difficult work of rebuilding his mind. Goggins emphasizes that this was a slow process. There were no shortcuts, no easy days, and no miracles. He began to study harder, to try more, to challenge himself academically even though he feared failure. He was still cheating sometimes, still afraid, still lost. But he was trying. And trying, in those moments, was revolutionary. He had never truly tried before, not because he didn't care, but because he believed he was incapable. Breaking that belief was the true beginning of his transformation. This chapter doesn't end with triumph or victory. There's no Hollywood ending here. Goggins doesn't suddenly become a straight-A student or discover a hidden genius. Instead, he introduces the central theme that will run through the rest of the book. Resilience isn't about winning, it's about refusing to quit. It's about doing the thing you believe you can't do, and doing it anyway. He began to redefine success not as perfection, but as grit. Every day he made the choice to try was a day. He won a small battle against the voice in his head that told him he was worthless. As Goggins peels back the layers of this time in his life, the chapter becomes less about external hardship and more about internal warfare. The real enemy wasn't racism, poverty, or even his abusive father. It was the belief that he was powerless to change his life. Once he began to shift that mindset, even slightly, the impossible task began to seem just a little more possible. Taking Souls is a deep dive into one of the most transformative philosophies in Goggins' life. It's not merely about pushing through adversity, but about turning the tables on those who underestimate, belittle, or challenge you, often unfairly, by outperforming them so thoroughly that they're forced to recognize your strength, even if they never admit it out loud. Taking Souls is a phrase that, in Goggins' lexicon, becomes emblematic of domination through discipline, resolve, and relentless effort. The chapter opens in the harsh, unrelenting world of Navy SEAL training, in particular during Goggins' time in BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL training. This is a time marked by intense physical and mental torment, where instructors are tasked with weeding out all but the most resilient candidates. It is here that Goggins confronts an environment not only built to break men but also controlled by people who seem to enjoy seeing others fall. One particular instructor becomes a focal point for the lesson Goggins is about to learn and transform into a life philosophy. This instructor sees Goggins not just as another trainee but as a symbol, someone to break, someone who doesn't belong. Goggins, as a black man who came into the SEAL pipeline overweight and an outsider to the culture, was already working against long odds. But this instructor's disdain adds another dimension. A personal vendetta, a need to prove that Goggins was unworthy of the elite company he aspired to join. Rather than get angry or crushed, Goggins recalibrates. He realizes something profound. The way to retaliate, to fight back in this environment, is not through confrontation or complaining. It's by outworking everyone, enduring the pain, and showing the instructors, and especially the one who targeted him, that they have no control over his spirit. He decides to become the hardest, most relentless trainee in the entire program. His goal shifts, not only to graduate BUD/S, but to dominate it in a way that makes those who doubted him question their assumptions. He wants to take their souls. Taking souls, as Goggins defines it, is not about revenge in the traditional sense. It is about owning the situation so completely that you force those around you, whether they're enemies, rivals, or doubters, to acknowledge your power. It's psychological warfare of a very personal kind. When you perform at a level so far above what's expected that it shatters the preconceived notions others had of you, you change the balance of power. Goggins realizes that even people in positions of authority can be shaken when they see someone rise from the ashes, someone they tried to break standing stronger than ever. He puts this idea into practice during one particularly grueling training day in Hell Week. The weather is freezing, the Pacific Ocean relentless, and the instructors are doing everything they can to push the trainees to quit. Goggins and his boat crew 2, are suffering like everyone else. But he makes a conscious decision. They will not merely survive, they will dominate. He rallies his team, instills them with the same fire, and begins pushing harder than ever. His crew starts to outperform all the others, running faster, working harder, screaming louder. The instructors, who had used this training to break the will of countless men, are visibly stunned. For a moment, their smug confidence wavers. Goggins knows it immediately. He's taken their souls. This concept isn't just about military training. Goggins begins applying it to every part of his life. Every time someone doubts him, he transforms that doubt into fuel. Every time someone expects him to fail, he uses their expectations as a launchpad to shatter their perceptions. The philosophy turns into an internal motivator. He's no longer working for accolades or even for survival. He's working to prove that no one can touch him. And in doing so, he gains an edge that goes beyond physical strength. He gains psychological dominance. Goggins reflects on the many times in his life where he's used this principle. One story that stands out is when he returns to BUD/S after being injured and forced to restart his training. It's his third time going through the process, an ordeal almost no one else endures. Most would see this as a curse, a stretch of bad luck that would justify quitting. But Goggins reframes it. This is an opportunity to prove, beyond all doubt, that he cannot be broken. That even Hell Week, endured 3 times, cannot stop him. He takes this perceived disadvantage and turns it into a tool. Every suffering moment becomes part of his psychological arsenal. He starts to welcome the pain because he knows it's the very thing that gives him power over those who try to control him. The idea of taking souls also spills into the realm of leadership. Goggins is not just doing this for himself. He becomes a motivator to others. His crew, Boat Crew 2, begins feeding off his energy. Their success isn't just individual. It's collective. This is another powerful dimension of the philosophy. Taking souls isn't only about personal vengeance or proving others wrong. It's about elevating the standard for everyone around you. When you push past limits in front of others, you challenge them to rise with you or be left behind. This kind of presence can ripple outwards, influencing teams, organizations, and even communities. Goggins also acknowledges that this mindset is not natural. It is built. It requires immense suffering and self-discipline. It demands that you silence your inner voice that seeks comfort, that you reject the easy way out. He describes how your mind is always looking for a way to avoid pain, to choose comfort over growth. But the only way to truly develop the ability to take souls is to override that impulse. When you willingly walk into the storm and emerge from it stronger, you develop what Goggins calls the callous mind. And the callous mind is the foundation of taking souls. A mind that has been toughened by struggle, rejection, pain, and perseverance. There's a deeper emotional undercurrent in this chapter as well. Goggins isn't just trying to prove something to others. He's also battling his own past. His childhood filled with abuse, racism, and fear. Every moment in BUD/S, every icy plunge into the ocean, Every insult hurled by instructors echoes back to those early traumas. Taking souls becomes a way of reclaiming power that was stripped from him as a child. It's about standing up to the world and saying, "You will not define me by my circumstances, by my appearance, by your expectations. I define myself." In this way, the philosophy becomes a form of healing, albeit an intense and brutal one. At the same time, Goggins is clear that this isn't about ego. It's not about being better than everyone else. It's about finding a sense of purpose and strength in the struggle. It's about using adversity as a teacher, not an enemy. When you take souls, you aren't lording power over others. You're illuminating what's possible when the human spirit is unleashed. And sometimes, this revelation forces others to examine their own weaknesses, which can either inspire them or leave them resentful. Either way, you've shifted the dynamic. Goggins includes stories from beyond BUD/S that show how this philosophy carries into the rest of his life. Whether it's in ultra-endurance races, deployments, or everyday challenges, the principle remains the same. When someone doubts him, challenges him, or tries to define his limits, he responds by taking their soul, showing them that they've underestimated not just him, but the human capacity to endure and thrive under pressure. Each new test is another opportunity to reinforce this identity, another battle to reaffirm that no one else has the right to dictate what he can or cannot do. By the end of the chapter, taking souls becomes more than a tactic, it becomes a code. It's a method for survival and domination in a world that often seems indifferent, even hostile. It's a way to assert your agency when everything seems stacked against you. It's a way to turn pain into purpose, hate into hunger, and adversity into advantage. Goggins doesn't claim this path is for everyone. It's painful, lonely, and full of sacrifice. But for those who walk it, it offers a kind of freedom that few ever experience. He challenges the reader, too, by the end of the chapter. Goggins doesn't want passive admiration. He wants you to try it. To look for the next time someone doubts you, overlooks you, or tries to bring you down, and respond not with words, but with action. To train harder, work longer, suffer willingly, and emerge with a power that even your enemies can't ignore. The ability to take souls, Goggins argues, is one of the most powerful tools any human being can develop, because once you've taken someone's soul, you've proven that your potential is not governed by their beliefs, but by your own unbreakable will. Armored Mind. David Goggins delves deeply into the mental transformation that enabled him to overcome extraordinary physical and emotional challenges. This chapter serves as a turning point in Goggins' journey, not merely of personal development but of forging an indestructible mindset that could weather anything life hurled at him. The armored mind is not a metaphor or feel-good phrase. It's a disciplined, hardened psychological state built layer by layer through pain, adversity, and deliberate exposure to suffering. The chapter opens with Goggins recounting a particularly brutal experience during Navy SEAL training, Hell Week. This 5.5-day crucible is designed to break even the most elite candidates, and for many, it does. By this point, Goggins was already in his third Hell Week, a feat that is nearly unheard of. The average person, after enduring it once, is either broken or has graduated. But Goggins' first 2 attempts had been cut short due to injuries, fractured kneecap, pneumonia, and this third try was his last shot. During this week of no sleep, constant physical torment, cold, and mental exhaustion, Goggins faced every reason to quit. But it was precisely during this time that something unshakable began to form within him, the armored mind. Unlike his previous attempts where his body had failed him, he realized that only a fortified mindset could carry him through this time. The pain didn't disappear, but his ability to coexist with pain without flinching evolved. Goggins takes readers into the trenches of this mental shift. Instead of fearing pain, he started to welcome it as a tool, even a friend. Pain became a test, and through each small victory, each moment he didn't quit, he built up a stockpile of evidence against his own internal critic, the inner voice that kept whispering he wasn't good enough, strong enough, smart enough. That voice, he explains, never truly goes away. It's part of being human. But what you can do is quiet it by proving it wrong over and over again. And this is where the concept of callousing the mind takes center stage. Just like hands develop calluses through repeated friction and hard work, The mind too can be conditioned through hardship. This doesn't happen by accident. It must be intentional. The mind won't strengthen itself sitting in comfort or convenience. To create an armored mind, one must expose it to suffering and refuse to flinch in the face of it. Goggins made a habit of deliberately seeking the hard path, the one that would test him the most. Whether it was going for a run in freezing temperatures, staying in an ice bath longer than others, or pushing his body beyond its perceived limits, he constantly chose discomfort. Not for vanity, not for the sake of being extreme, but to build a level of mental resilience most people never reach. He brings up the concept of the cookie jar here, which becomes an essential tool in his mental arsenal. The cookie jar is a mental repository of all the hardships he's overcome. When faced with a challenge, Goggins metaphorically reaches into that jar and pulls out a memory. A time he succeeded against the odds, a moment when he endured what others wouldn't. These memories aren't grand achievements alone. Often, they're small, seemingly insignificant victories. Getting through a painful run, passing a hard test, finishing a workout when he felt like quitting. Over time, each of these cookies becomes a reminder of who he is and what he's capable of. This concept reflects a larger truth in Goggins' philosophy: we must be our own heroes. Too often, people wait for validation, encouragement, or permission from others. But if you rely on others to keep you going, you'll quit the minute they stop showing up. Goggins argues that real strength comes from internal validation. You have to become the one who keeps yourself in the fight when everything in your life is falling apart. That's what the armored mind allows you to do. He explores this further by talking about the governor in our minds, the internal mechanism that limits our performance. Goggins compares the brain to a car with a built-in governor, a speed limiter. Most people only use about 40% of their total capacity before they mentally quit. When you think you're done, you still have 60% left. But you'll never know it if you don't push past the initial limits. Goggins argues that the armored mind allows you to disable that governor. It doesn't happen overnight. But the more you push, the more you realize how much untapped potential lies dormant beneath your perceived limits. This is where Goggins' life story becomes a form of instruction. He wasn't born with some special talent. In fact, quite the opposite. He came from abuse, poverty, learning disabilities, and low self-esteem. But through conscious suffering, he turned pain into power. Each time he refused to quit, in SEAL training, in ultra-endurance races, in brutal workouts, he layered his mind with another coat of armor. Pain was no longer his enemy. It was his crucible, his teacher. Goggins also touches on the importance of visualization and mental rehearsal. Before major events, a 100-mile race, a BUD/S evolution, a tough workout, he visualized the worst-case scenarios. He didn't pump himself up with positive thinking. Instead, he prepared for the worst. He asked himself, what if everything goes wrong? What if it rains the entire time? What if my legs give out? What if I get injured? This way, when things did go wrong, and they usually did, he wasn't surprised. He was already mentally rehearsed for the suffering. This made him less reactive and more composed under pressure. In a world where many people chase comfort, instant gratification, and validation, Goggins preaches the opposite. He believes that real happiness and freedom lie on the other side of suffering. You can't buy the armored mind. You can't fake it. You have to earn it through sacrifice. And the currency is pain, repetition, and discipline. Toward the end of the chapter, Goggins shares an important nuance. This path is not for everyone. He doesn't pretend that becoming mentally armored is easy. In fact, it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. It means waking up early when you don't want to, running when you're exhausted, studying when your brain is fried, holding yourself accountable when no one else is watching. And it means doing it not once or twice, but every single day. But for those who do choose this path, the reward is internal freedom, the kind of peace that comes from knowing that no matter what happens in life, you are capable of facing it. Because you've faced yourself. You've stared into the mirror and decided to forge a better version of you. Not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. That's what the armored mind gives you, the ability to endure anything without becoming a victim of it. He closes the chapter by reinforcing the idea that life will always test you. It's not a matter of if hardship will come, but when. Most people hope it won't come, and when it does, they're unprepared. Goggins lives differently. He assumes that hardship is coming. He invites it, and because of that, when the storms of life arrive, he doesn't break. He's armored. It's not about a trophy. David Goggins delves into the core philosophy that defines much of his life and ethos. The pursuit of greatness for its own sake, not for validation, fame, or tangible rewards, but for the internal transformation that comes from mastering the mind and enduring suffering. This chapter pivots away from the physical exploits that have defined earlier sections and turns more deeply into the realm of mental fortitude, purpose, and the spiritual evolution that occurs when someone is no longer driven by trophies but by something far more elusive and eternal: character. The chapter opens with a reflection on what drove Goggins to subject himself to such extreme physical and mental trials. By this point in the book, readers have already seen him survive brutal Navy SEAL training, complete multiple ultramarathons, break a world pull-up record, and confront a lifetime of trauma, racism, and learning disabilities. But here, Goggins begins to separate himself from the average competitor. Most people, he argues, are chasing trophies, symbols of success that give them temporary satisfaction, whether they be medals, applause, recognition, or even a sense of superiority. However, Goggins insists that these are fleeting victories, shallow and unsatisfying in the long run. He describes a transformative realization. The greatest achievements in life are not those that can be displayed on a shelf or listed on a resume. True accomplishment comes from the pursuit of mastery over the self. The essence of this mastery is rooted in suffering. Specifically, the willingness to suffer voluntarily and repeatedly, even when there's no audience, no finish line, and no visible reward. The idea is to become something that cannot be measured or celebrated publicly. A person who knows deep down that they've pushed beyond every limit they thought they had. To illustrate this point, Goggins recounts one of the most physically and mentally devastating races he's ever run: the Badwater 135, a grueling 135-mile ultramarathon through Death Valley in the middle of summer. The temperatures are hellish, reaching over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Most people would find it unimaginable to even consider running in such conditions, let alone pushing their body across 135 miles of desert, mountains, and pain. But Goggins doesn't run races like these for the medal or the acclaim. In fact, he's skeptical of the entire culture of racing for the sake of winning. For him, the Badwater race is not about standing on a podium. It's about confronting his inner demons, breaking through the boundaries of self-doubt, and discovering new layers of resilience. As the race progresses, Goggins's body begins to deteriorate. He vomits, becomes dehydrated, and starts hallucinating. Every fiber of his being is telling him to stop, to quit, to find relief. But it is precisely in these moments, when the average person gives up, when the pain becomes unbearable, when the brain is screaming for mercy, that Goggins finds clarity. The suffering acts as a forge, burning away superficial motives and leaving only the core of who he is. Through this suffering, he achieves something that can't be measured by finish times or rankings. He transcends the pain and, in doing so, proves to himself once again that the mind is capable of far more than we are taught to believe. What's important here is not just the physical feat, but the mindset. Goggins reflects on how, during these moments, he begins talking to himself, not in a defeated tone but in one of defiance. He reminds himself of all he's been through: his abusive childhood, his struggles in school, his failures, his self-doubt, and how he has overcome every one of those barriers. In these races, he reconnects with his own story and transforms it from a tale of victimhood to one of ownership and strength. Goggins also introduces an important concept in this chapter: the cookie jar. The cookie jar is a mental reserve of past victories, struggles overcome, and moments of perseverance. Whenever he's feeling low, defeated, or unmotivated, he reaches into this cookie jar and pulls out reminders of who he really is, proof that he has endured and survived worse. This practice is not about glorifying the past or becoming arrogant. Instead, it's a strategy to remember the truth: that pain is temporary, and that he is capable of overcoming any hardship because he's done it before. He emphasizes that self-mastery requires intentional suffering, not once, but over and over again. And this suffering must be embraced willingly, not avoided. It's not enough to passively wait for life's challenges to build strength. Instead, one must seek out hardship, take ownership of suffering, and use it as a crucible to develop discipline and resilience. This goes beyond physical endurance. It's about spiritual and emotional toughness, about showing up for yourself every single day, even when nobody is watching and there's no reward in sight. Goggins shares a number of personal stories to reinforce this idea. He talks about being invited to races or events where people idolize him and expect to see some larger-than-life athlete who thrives on applause. But he resists this narrative. He doesn't want to be anyone's hero or celebrity. In fact, he's deeply uncomfortable with that idea. Because once you begin performing for others, for likes, for followers, for admiration, you've already lost the essence of why you began. You're no longer suffering for self-mastery. You're suffering for validation. And validation is hollow. The only reward that matters is the self-respect that comes from knowing you pushed beyond your limits when no one else was looking. Another powerful theme in this chapter is the idea of internal callousing, the mental equivalent of the calluses that develop on the hands through repeated physical labor. Just as a laborer's hands become tougher over time, the mind too can develop calluses if it is repeatedly exposed to discomfort, pain, and challenge. These calluses protect you from self-doubt, fear, and weakness. They're not visible, but they're critical. And the only way to build them is through suffering. Not just once, but again and again. Goggins contrasts this mindset with the culture of comfort that surrounds most people. Society, he argues, encourages ease, shortcuts, and quick rewards. We're taught to avoid pain, to chase trophies, and to find happiness through external measures. But this is a dangerous illusion. True fulfillment doesn't come from easy victories or momentary pleasures. It comes from enduring the hardest challenges and discovering who you are on the other side. And in that process, you stop caring about trophies. You become addicted not to success, but to the person you're becoming through the pursuit. He also discusses how easy it is to start believing your own hype, especially once you achieve a certain level of success. After people start calling you a badass or a legend, you might begin to lower your standards, thinking you've already made it. But Goggins warns against this trap. He shares how he constantly reinvents himself, pushing beyond the identity that others try to project onto him. Just because he finished a race or broke a record doesn't mean he's done growing. Complacency is the enemy. The moment you start coasting, you start dying inside. That's why he insists on starting over every day, as if none of his past accomplishments matter, because in truth, they don't. The only thing that matters is what you're willing to endure today. This philosophy extends to every area of life, not just athletics. Goggins argues that this mindset is available to anyone, whether you're a parent, a student, a worker, or a soldier. You don't need to run ultramarathons to develop mental toughness. What you need is to challenge yourself daily, face your fears, embrace discomfort, and stop making excuses. The moment you stop seeking trophies and start seeking growth, everything changes. You begin to live with purpose. You begin to develop a kind of quiet pride that no one can take from you. Toward the end of the chapter, Goggins reflects on the irony of it all. The less he cared about trophies, the more he began to accomplish. When he stopped chasing approval and started chasing self-respect, doors opened. His accomplishments began to multiply, but he didn't care about them the way he once might have. He was more focused on becoming the hardest, most resilient, most honest version of himself. And that is the ultimate victory, not one that can be measured, but one that is felt deep in the soul. The most powerful weapon, from Can't Hurt Me, David Goggins explores the idea that the human mind is the most powerful weapon we possess. This chapter does not only delve into the grueling physical aspects of Goggins' journey, but instead focuses on the transformation that occurred within his psyche, and how mastering his mind became the defining trait that allowed him to achieve what once seemed impossible. His experiences illustrate a principle that is both philosophical and deeply personal, that the path to true greatness and personal freedom lies not in physical strength alone, but in mental resilience and control over one's internal dialogue. Goggins begins by reflecting on the completion of his first Navy SEAL Hell Week, a feat that only a few ever accomplish, and he had now done it not once, but 3 times. While this might have seemed like a reason to celebrate, Goggins didn't feel a sense of accomplishment. Instead, he felt empty. The physical suffering had ended, but he recognized a deeper issue. Despite overcoming the brutal physical challenges, he had not yet truly confronted and defeated the mental demons that plagued him. His pain, fear, insecurity, and childhood trauma still lingered within him. This realization led him to the conclusion that while he had conquered many external battles, the war inside was still ongoing, and that war was infinitely more critical. He reflects back on his abusive and traumatic childhood, where violence, racism, and neglect were common themes. Goggins recounts moments from his early life when he was helpless, often frozen by fear or shame, unable to stand up for himself. These moments etched themselves into his identity. He came to believe he was weak, dumb, and unworthy. For a long time, those labels governed his actions and his self-perception. Even as he wore the uniform of a SEAL, those internal voices still whispered doubts. This contradiction, being perceived as elite by the world while feeling broken inside, fueled his deep desire for mental mastery. Goggins introduces the concept of the accountability mirror as a way to confront uncomfortable truths. He emphasizes that most people are unwilling to face themselves honestly. We create narratives to shield ourselves from the pain of our failures, shortcomings, and missed opportunities. The accountability mirror became his way of looking past the mask and confronting the raw, unfiltered truth. He would post notes on the mirror that outlined what he needed to improve, not in a self-loathing way, but as a declaration of accountability. This daily ritual became a cornerstone in the development of what he now calls the mental callus, the toughening of the mind in the same way one builds calluses on their hands through hard labor. The idea of callousing the mind is central to this chapter. Just as calluses form over time through friction and resistance, the mind becomes tougher and more resilient through adversity, repetition, and discipline. Goggins explains that most people avoid discomfort. Society conditions us to pursue pleasure and avoid pain at all costs, but he argues that this mindset creates weakness. Pain, he insists, is the best teacher, and choosing to live in comfort is choosing mediocrity. When the mind is exposed to repeated hardship and taught to persevere, it grows stronger. Over time, this process hardens the individual against fear, self-doubt, and emotional reactivity. It enables a person to take control of their thoughts instead of being a prisoner to them. One of the core messages of this chapter is that suffering is a gift when approached with the right mindset. Goggins writes that most people see suffering as a sign that something is wrong, a cue to stop or quit. But for him, suffering became a path to truth and transformation. He describes his experiences pushing his body beyond its limits, running on fractured legs, or continuing training while sick, not to glorify self-destruction, but to illustrate that the human body is capable of far more than the mind believes. When you reach your physical limits, your mind tells you to stop, but Goggins teaches that this is often just the beginning. He references what he calls the 40% rule, the idea that when you feel completely done, you're only 40% of the way to your potential. The remaining 60% lies locked behind mental barriers that most people never attempt to break through. The chapter transitions into a discussion of identity. Goggins challenges the reader to stop clinging to titles, accomplishments, and societal roles. He shares how becoming a Navy SEAL or an ultra-endurance athlete was never about the external validation or recognition. These achievements were simply tools to chip away at the limiting beliefs he had about himself. He insists that transformation happens only when you step beyond the ego and choose discomfort, failure, and humility over prestige. Your truest self, he argues, is not found in your resume or accolades, but in who you become through adversity. The narrative then shifts to Goggins' time after his initial SEAL experience, when he was striving to become an ultra-endurance athlete. He signed up for some of the most punishing races in the world, not for fame or money, but to test and strengthen his mind. He recounts a particularly brutal 100-mile race, the San Diego One Day, where he ran on little preparation, pushing through the agony of broken bones, internal bleeding, and dehydration. Most people would see this as insane or even irresponsible. But to Goggins, it was another battlefield to confront his mind. Every step was an opportunity to face down his inner voice, the one that told him he was nothing, that he wasn't enough. In that pain, he discovered the profound truth. Mastery of the mind requires a willingness to go beyond the ordinary, to silence the false stories we tell ourselves, and to find strength in the dark places we usually run from. What separates high achievers from everyone else, Goggins emphasizes, is not talent or luck, but the willingness to suffer deliberately and consistently. He doesn't discount the reality of pain or hardship. On the contrary, he insists on facing it without flinching. To him, every setback, every bout of suffering was a tool for refinement. This mindset allowed him to flip the narrative. Instead of being a victim of circumstance, he became the architect of his transformation. In discussing fear, Goggins acknowledges that he, too, has fear of failure, of inadequacy, of reverting to the man he once was. But he doesn't see fear as a reason to retreat. Instead, he uses fear as a compass. Whatever scares him most is usually the very thing he needs to pursue. Fear, he suggests, is a signpost for growth. By running toward fear and discomfort, he consistently discovered greater versions of himself. This habit, over time, redefined his identity. He was no longer the broken boy from an abusive home. He had become a warrior, not because of the uniform he wore, but because of the strength he forged within. The chapter also makes an important point about self-discipline. For Goggins, discipline is not a burden, but a form of self-respect. Discipline, he explains, is what allows you to do what needs to be done even when you don't feel like it. The mind will always find excuses, always seek the path of least resistance, but discipline steps in as the antidote to procrastination and weakness. Without discipline, the mind becomes a tool of chaos, dragging us toward mediocrity. With it, we become intentional creators of our lives. He speaks of the satisfaction that comes from doing the hard things not because someone told you to, but because you demanded it of yourself. That kind of internal accountability is rare, and that's exactly what makes it powerful. As the chapter concludes, Goggins circles back to the central theme, that the most powerful weapon we have is our mind. Specifically, a mind that has been trained to endure, to question, to resist comfort, and to push beyond perceived limits. It's not about being fearless, but about being willing to face fear and keep moving anyway. It's not about being naturally strong or fast, but about building strength through discipline and pain. And it's not about winning in the eyes of others, but about winning the internal war, the silent battle that no one else sees. He urges the reader to stop looking for shortcuts. There is no hack for mastering the mind. It requires consistent, deliberate suffering, not for its own sake, but because it's through suffering that you forge something unbreakable. Goggins' life is a testament to that principle. By relentlessly pushing past the barriers his mind tried to erect, he turned pain into purpose and suffering into self-mastery. Ultimately, the most powerful weapon is not just a reflection on Goggins' past experiences. It's a call to arms. He is inviting the reader to step into the arena, to stop playing small, and to recognize that the greatest force we have at our disposal is not some external tool, but the mind itself. When trained and wielded correctly, the mind becomes an unstoppable force capable of transforming a broken past into a powerful future. Talent Not Required from David Goggins' memoir Can't Hurt Me. Goggins dismantles the cultural obsession with talent and argues powerfully for the value of hard work, discipline, and mental toughness over innate ability. Through vivid storytelling and candid self-reflection, he challenges the reader to abandon excuses and embrace the grind, even when it feels unbearable. This chapter continues to build upon the book's central theme, that greatness is not born but earned, through suffering, self-mastery, and relentless effort. Goggins begins by reflecting on a pivotal realization that changed his outlook on success. Talent is overrated. He recounts how society tends to glorify those with natural abilities, athletes, intellectuals, artists, assuming their excellence is a result of something they were simply born with. This belief, Goggins argues, is dangerous. It creates a false narrative that excuses the rest of us from putting in the hard work by convincing us that if we weren't gifted from the start, we'll never reach greatness. Goggins knows this mindset all too well, because he once believed it himself. For much of his life, he saw himself as a weak, unremarkable person with little potential. But through extreme mental and physical training, he proved that consistent effort can transcend natural gifts. To make his case, Goggins delves into his experience as a Navy SEAL and ultra-endurance athlete, environments where talent can give a head start but doesn't guarantee success. He shares stories of men who appeared to be strong, fast, and confident but crumbled under the pressure of SEAL training. Conversely, those who may not have stood out at first, those who lacked the outward signs of greatness, sometimes pushed past everyone else because of their grit and determination. Goggins identifies mental toughness as the ultimate equalizer. Unlike talent, which you either have or don't, mental toughness is a skill anyone can build through suffering and repetition. It is forged in the furnace of adversity. The most compelling evidence of his thesis is his own transformation. Goggins wasn't born strong. He was an overweight, insecure young man, shaped by trauma, abuse, and poverty. But once he made the decision to change his life, he embraced suffering like no one else. He pushed himself through Hell Week 3 times to become a SEAL, ran hundreds of miles with broken legs, and completed ultramarathons that seemed impossible even to seasoned athletes. Every step of the way, he ignored the seductive myth of talent and instead relied on what he calls the accountability mirror, a brutally honest daily self-assessment that reminded him of who he was and who he wanted to be. One of the key messages in this chapter is about the danger of comparing yourself to others. Goggins criticizes the societal trend of looking up to celebrities, athletes, and successful people as if they're part of a different species. In doing so, we subconsciously give ourselves permission to stay average. If someone else is winning because they're gifted, then we can't be blamed for not matching their success. Goggins sees this as a mental cop-out, a form of self-deception that keeps us stuck. He insists that the real reason most people don't achieve their potential is because they aren't willing to suffer. They want the results without the sacrifice. They're looking for shortcuts, talent, hacks, easy wins, when the only path to mastery is through relentless hard work and self-discipline. Goggins backs up his argument with examples from his time as a military man and ultra-endurance athlete. He tells the story of how he began training for ultramarathons with almost no formal running background. He entered a 100-mile race with very little preparation and no crew to support him. His body broke down, his feet bled, his bones ached, he urinated blood, but he kept running. Through sheer willpower, he finished the race. This, he says, is what separates people who succeed from those who don't, not talent, but a refusal to quit. The race wasn't about speed or strength. It was about how much pain he was willing to endure. He knew that he didn't have the genetics of a champion runner, but what he did have was far more valuable: an iron mind. Another powerful idea in this chapter is Goggins' emphasis on voluntary suffering. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort, but Goggins actively seeks it out. He believes that by putting yourself through suffering, you learn things about yourself that you can't discover any other way. Pain, failure, and hardship become teachers. The more you suffer deliberately, the more calloused your mind becomes. This mental callus, built through reps of hardship, allows you to push far beyond what you previously thought was possible. And once you realize how much potential lies dormant within you, you begin to crave suffering, because it's the only path to awakening that potential. Throughout the chapter, Goggins uses his life as a blueprint for what anyone can achieve if they stop making excuses. He's brutally honest about his shortcomings and failures, but that's exactly what makes his message so empowering. He isn't selling a fantasy of overnight success or divine gifts. He's offering a roadmap that's available to anyone, regardless of background, intelligence, or natural ability. The roadmap is simple but not easy. Suffer, reflect, suffer more, and get better. Over time, this builds not only skills and strength, but unshakable confidence. Because when you've survived hell, when you've faced your weaknesses head-on and conquered them, you become someone who cannot be broken. An essential tool Goggins discusses in this chapter is what he calls the cookie jar, a mental reserve of past victories and accomplishments that you can draw upon when you're struggling. When pain and doubt creep in, He reaches into the cookie jar and reminds himself of all the times he pushed through seemingly impossible situations. These memories serve as evidence that he is capable of more. This tool doesn't rely on talent either. It's built through lived experience. Every time you overcome a challenge, you add a cookie to the jar. It becomes a library of grit, a personal history of triumph over weakness. As the chapter unfolds, Goggins also critiques the education system and broader social norms that reward performance over perseverance. He recalls how he once struggled academically and was labeled slow, but later realized that he simply hadn't been trying hard enough. He had accepted mediocrity because it was easier than struggling. But when he stopped avoiding the grind and started pushing himself mentally, he saw rapid improvement. He eventually passed tough military tests and scored highly on academic assessments, not because he was smart, but because he studied harder than anyone else. He sees this as proof that mental work ethic can outpace intellectual talent, just as physical grit can outperform athletic gifts. Goggins insists that everyone has untapped potential, but most will never access it because they stay in their comfort zones. He challenges the reader to go to war with themselves, to stare into the mirror and confront all the lies and excuses they've been telling. He isn't interested in motivation or feel-good speeches. His message is about radical accountability. If you aren't where you want to be, it's your fault. And if you want to change that, no one is coming to save you. You'll have to suffer more than you ever imagined. But if you do, you'll build strength that no one can take away from you. Not talent, not luck, not external validation. Near the end of the chapter, Goggins sums up the ethos of this entire section. The only thing standing between you and greatness is your unwillingness to suffer. He doesn't sugarcoat the process. He doesn't pretend that hard work guarantees success. But he does promise that the path of effort, struggle, and discipline will reveal more of your potential than any natural talent ever could. His life is living proof. He went from an abused, overweight dropout to one of the most respected endurance athletes and military operatives in the world. Not because he was gifted, but because he refused to give up. The concept of being uncommon amongst the uncommon came to Goggins during his time in the SEALs. In that world, everyone was already elite. Every man had passed through the infamous Hell Week. Every man was in top physical shape and had demonstrated extreme mental fortitude. And yet, even in this group of warriors, Goggins noticed a subtle stratification. Most people, having reached this level, stopped pushing. They were content with having arrived. For them, the journey of becoming exceptional ended with the SEAL trident. But not for Goggins. He realized that most people plateau. They hit a high point and camp out there, basking in the glow of past achievements. This is true not just in the military but across life, in sports, academics, corporate settings. People strive to become the best in their field, but once they get close, they let off the gas. The discipline that once fueled their ascent is slowly replaced by comfort. But Goggins, never one to settle, decided he wouldn't be that person. He didn't want to be known just as a SEAL or just as a hard man. He wanted to push beyond even that identity. He wanted to be a standout in a sea of standouts. That decision wasn't about competition with others, though. Goggins emphasizes that being uncommon among the uncommon has nothing to do with beating other people or showing off. It's a competition against yourself, against complacency, against your own perceived limitations. The real enemy is mediocrity disguised as excellence. In elite environments, mediocrity wears a better suit, but it's still mediocrity. Goggins set out to kill it every single day. He recounts a specific episode from his time in Iraq as a SEAL where he was embedded with the Army Rangers. The SEALs, typically operating in highly specialized and elite missions, were sent to support a conventional Army unit. Many of the SEALs saw this as beneath them. They didn't take the assignment seriously, seeing the Rangers as less trained, less capable. Goggins, however, saw something different. He admired the discipline of the Rangers, their strict adherence to military standards, their humility, their relentless work ethic. These men, though not as decorated or glorified as SEALs, maintained an operational tempo and level of precision that impressed him. Rather than pull rank or join in the elitist mentality of his teammates, Goggins humbled himself and started training with the Rangers. He woke up with them, did their PT, physical training, stood in formation, and lived their life. He didn't have to. He already had the badge and the title. But to Goggins, growth doesn't care about status. If you aren't getting better, you're getting worse. And learning from people, even those below your technical level, was one of his keys to remaining uncommon. That humility, paired with his ferocious drive, is what makes this chapter so powerful. Goggins recognizes that being uncommon among uncommon people requires an unrelenting commitment to growth, which often means going where others won't, doing what others won't, and thinking in ways others don't. It requires you to silence the ego, embrace humility, and outwork everyone, even when you've already outworked them. One of the pivotal moments in the chapter is Goggins' reflection on leadership. He talks about how leadership in elite environments often becomes passive. In communities like the SEALs, where everyone is already top tier, the assumption is that no one needs to be pushed. But that's a mistake. Leadership, Goggins argues, is about setting a standard through your actions, not resting on shared reputations. He began to lead not through command, but through conduct. By pushing himself harder, waking earlier, training longer, and never cutting corners, he became a silent yet powerful motivator for others. He doesn't shy away from admitting that this lifestyle is isolating. Being uncommon among the uncommon is lonely. People begin to distance themselves, either because they feel judged or because your intensity reminds them of what they aren't doing. Goggins describes the psychological toll of walking this path, not because he sought approval, but because being so different can sometimes feel like being alien. But he accepted that. He embraced the loneliness because it was a byproduct of living authentically at full throttle. This chapter also reflects on his broader philosophy of never being satisfied. Goggins doesn't believe in finish lines. Even when he accomplished major milestones such as completing BUD/S 3 times, running ultramarathons, setting pull-up world records, and becoming a SEAL and Army Ranger, he refused to linger in the glow of those successes. To him, each achievement is merely a checkpoint. The real prize is in the grind, in the willingness to suffer, to bleed, and to keep showing up when there's no one clapping, no spotlight, and no finish line. That's not to say Goggins is joyless or obsessed with punishment. Rather, he finds meaning in the suffering because it purifies intent. When you do things without the promise of praise or reward, when you push yourself beyond reason just to see what you're made of, you develop a kind of spiritual strength. It's about owning your identity, not borrowing it from institutions, titles, or ranks. You become your own standard. There's also a strong psychological thread running through this chapter. Goggins introduces the idea of the mental cookie jar, a tool he uses to reach deeper levels of resolve during moments of weakness. When the going gets brutal, he mentally revisits past achievements, moments when he overcame impossible odds. These memories, stored like cookies in a jar, become fuel. But in this chapter, he challenges even that. He says if you're using those memories as crutches to justify resting on your laurels, you're slipping. The cookie jar isn't a trophy case. It's a reminder of who you were. And a question. Are you still that person? Are you still willing to go back to the pain cave and fight? Goggins' insights apply far beyond the military. He draws parallels to the workplace, athletics, academics, and even relationships. Anywhere that excellence is rewarded, there is a tendency to coast once you've achieved a certain level. Promotions, titles, accolades, they become ceilings instead of springboards. Goggins argues that to live a truly uncommon life, you must reject that complacency. You must chase discomfort, seek challenge, and refuse the seductive whispers of comfort that come after success. The chapter ends on a powerful, almost philosophical note. Goggins reflects on mortality, on the idea that when he dies, he wants to meet the version of himself that lived to his fullest potential. And when that moment comes, he wants there to be no difference between that ideal version and the man he became. To do that, he must not only reach greatness but exceed it, and then exceed that, again and again, until the day he can no longer breathe. Being uncommon among the uncommon is not a single act. It is a lifestyle. It's not about winning races, titles, or competitions. It's about conquering yourself every day, every hour. It's about staying hard in a world that constantly offers you softness. It's about living in such a way that your existence becomes an act of rebellion against mediocrity, even elite mediocrity. Goggins begins by highlighting the toxic mindset most people inherit about failure. From an early age, society teaches us to fear failure, to see it as shameful or as a sign that we're not good enough. In school, we're punished for getting things wrong. In sports, losing is met with disappointment. In relationships, failure is often accompanied by guilt or rejection. The result is a culture where people go to great lengths to avoid falling short. But in doing so, they also avoid stepping outside their comfort zones. They trade in the pursuit of excellence for the safety of mediocrity. For Goggins, this mindset is a kind of spiritual death. True growth, he insists, begins only when we confront and embrace failure as the path to discovering who we really are. He recounts his own journey through failure, starting with some of the most painful moments of his life, those times when his aspirations collided with harsh reality. One of the defining early moments in this journey was his first attempt at becoming a Navy SEAL. After managing to scrape into BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, the toughest military training on the planet, he was soon sidelined by injury. The training was brutal and unrelenting. Despite his incredible desire, his body gave out. He was rolled back and then he failed again. Most people would have quit at that point, and many did. But Goggins didn't. Instead, he embraced the failure, learned from it, and came back stronger. He endured 3 hell weeks in BUD/S, an unprecedented feat, because each failure became a brick in the mental fortress he was building. One of the most telling stories Goggins shares in this chapter is about his failed attempts at the U.S. Army's Delta Force Selection Course, one of the most secretive and elite programs in the military. Goggins, already a Navy SEAL and an accomplished endurance athlete at the time, still failed the grueling selection process. Twice. The first time, he didn't make it through. The second time, he came closer but was still dropped. This wasn't just physically painful, it was psychologically humiliating. But rather than allowing these failures to define him, he used them as motivation. He didn't see them as closed doors, but as opportunities to get better, to understand what went wrong, and to improve himself. To him, failure wasn't an end. It was feedback. Central to this idea is what Goggins calls the accountability mirror. Every night, he would look into his mirror and confront himself, not with pity or rationalizations, but with brutal honesty. If he failed, he asked why. What did he do wrong? Where did he fall short? What did he overlook? This self-confrontation wasn't about tearing himself down. It was about taking full ownership of his life. Most people are quick to blame others or circumstances for their failures. But Goggins insists that real growth only happens when you accept 100% responsibility for everything in your life, even the things that seem unfair. Because once you own your failure, you also own the power to change the outcome. Another powerful theme in the chapter is the relationship between failure and fear. Goggins explains that people fear failure because they fear judgment, both from others and from themselves. We're terrified of being seen as weak, incapable, or less than. But this fear is a prison. It keeps us from taking risks, trying new things, or striving beyond our perceived limits. Goggins argues that the only way to destroy this fear is to voluntarily walk into it, to fail on purpose if necessary, and to strip failure of its power. The more you fail, the less you fear it. And the less you fear it, the more you grow. For Goggins, failure is not something to avoid but something to seek. Each failure sharpens your edge and strengthens your resolve. He draws a sharp contrast between people who live in what he calls a fixed mindset and those who develop what psychologist Carol Dweck termed a growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, failure confirms your worst fears, that you're not good enough, that you're stupid or weak. But in a growth mindset, failure is information. It tells you where you are, but not where you can go. Goggins clearly lives in the growth mindset, not because he was born that way, but because he trained himself to see the world through the lens of constant improvement. To him, there is no such thing as permanent failure, only feedback loops. One of the more personal and emotionally raw parts of the chapter involves Goggins describing his failures as a student and as a young man dealing with the trauma of his childhood. For a long time, he carried around the weight of being called dumb, slow, and worthless. These labels stuck to him like scars. His failures in school were not just academic, they were emotional. They confirmed what he had been told by abusive authority figures, and for a while he believed them. But as he began to achieve physically and prove his toughness to the world, he realized he could also challenge those mental and emotional narratives. He began reading, studying, and attacking learning with the same tenacity he brought to his physical training. He failed many times along the way, but each failure became a step on the path to transformation. Importantly, Goggins doesn't glamorize failure for its own sake. He is clear that failure hurts, can be devastating, but what matters is what you do after. Do you let the pain define you, or do you use it as fuel? He talks about the value of what he calls callousing the mind. Just as hands get tougher with use, the mind gets tougher with repeated exposure to adversity. Each failure, each setback, each disappointment is a chance to build mental calluses. These don't make you insensitive or hard in a negative way, they make you resilient. They give you the mental armor to keep going when everyone else quits. This mental toughness is not something reserved for elite athletes or Navy SEALs. Goggins insists it's available to anyone who's willing to do the work. And failure is the work. It's the curriculum for life's most important lessons. He encourages readers to start small. Try something that scares you, attempt something you might fail at, and then observe how you respond. If you fail, don't retreat, lean in. Ask yourself hard questions, learn, adapt, and go again. The process of learning from failure is not glamorous, but it is liberating. Over time, as you build this discipline, you begin to see failure not as a threat to your identity, but as a confirmation that you're on the edge of growth. One of the final messages of the chapter is about internal versus external validation. Goggins points out that many people fear failure because they're addicted to praise. They want to be liked, respected, and admired. But this external validation is fleeting. Can't sustain you when things get hard. The only validation that matters, he argues, is the validation you give yourself. When you look in the mirror, can you say with honesty that you tried your hardest, that you owned your mistakes, and that you're committed to growth? That is the true measure of a person, not how many times they succeeded, but how they respond when they fall. In the end, the empowerment of failure is not just a meditation on a concept, it's a battle cry. Goggins is challenging readers to change their relationship with failure, to stop fearing it, to stop letting it define or diminish them, and instead, to embrace it as one of life's most powerful tools for transformation. Every failure carries within it the seeds of greatness, if you're willing to look, to learn, and to keep going. Goggins' life is living proof of this. Not because he avoided failure, but because he walked through it again and again until it became his ally.